God chose to make us fragile, vulnerable, dependent, and to use a philosophical term, contingent. A word of prayer as we stand. Heavenly Father, take my lips and speak through them. Take our minds and think through them. And take our lives and live through them to the glory of the Lord Jesus. Amen. Please sit down. Well, it's a real privilege for me to have this opportunity to share this morning and this evening. And really these two talks are two parts trying to reflect together on this deep and mysterious topic of human suffering. And of course we don't need to stress the point of how every time you switch on the television, look at the internet, so often there are these global stories of tragedy, the human tragedies behind the shootings in Las Vegas, the loss of life and the destruction in the Caribbean islands and southern USA, mass killings and torture and rape and dislocation in Yemen and Syria and Iraq, thousands of refugees, including women and children, drowning every day in the Mediterranean Ocean. So at a global level, there is terrible suffering, but of course, on an individual level, and I have to say, as a doctor, over my career of more than 25 years, I've seen so much suffering. I've seen stillborn babies. I've seen lethal congenital abnormalities, young people struck down by terminal illness, elderly people affected by dementia and other cruel diseases. And many times I've held in my arms the bodies of dead babies and wept with parents at the tragedy of a life snuffed out within hours or days of birth, and at my own failure as a pediatrician to find a way to stop death happening. The next slide just shows one of the babies on the baby unit, and I've had the privilege of caring for many thousands of tiny babies, some of them so small they go down to 500 grams, literally fitting in the palm of my hand. And there's a terrible, tragic irony when you see a little life like that struggling and suffering and sometimes being snuffed out. And you say, why? Why is it happening? And there are many people here, I know, in this church who've been touched by inexplicable suffering and evil. Perhaps you're carrying within yourself some deep sense of tragedy and suffering. And you know, if we're Christian people, then we need to engage with this reality, with the painful realities of our world and of our own experience. And we have to talk about these issues, if you like, with tears in our eyes, not with simplistic statements and answers. And if you've come thinking and wanting to find some nice, slick, simple answer to these painful realities of suffering and evil, then I'm afraid you're going to be very disappointed this morning, because I don't have any simple, slick answers, and I don't believe there are any simple answers. But together we can think and reflect on the strange mystery of suffering. And the first thing is to acknowledge that there is something deeply weird and strange and inexplicable about this topic. We should beware the tendency of some Christians to come up with neat explanations for suffering. That's what theologians call theodicies, theological explanations of suffering and evil. The next slide shows, I think, a picture of just brain damage in a tiny baby, a baby who died. These are some of the dangers of coming up with neat little answers. First of all, the danger is that we minimize or trivialize the awfulness and the depth of human suffering. There's a danger that we say, well, it's not that bad really, and lots of good things happen, so we shouldn't get too, don't overemphasize it. We sort of trivialize the awfulness of what is happening. Or the second danger with these kind of explanations is they imply that God is less than fully good. Yes, he's a good God, but sometimes he seems to do things which, they're a bit strange and a bit weird, and, maybe he's not quite the God we think he is. That his goodness is partial or variable or suspect. Or the third danger is we reduce God to a powerless observer of a world that's out of control. That God's doing his best. He's trying to bring it all to good, but there's just things are going on that are out of control. Now, if we really want to take the revelation of God in the face of Jesus Christ, if we want to take the God who is revealed in the Bible and in Jesus seriously, then all of these three options are not helpful. They're not consistent with the God revealed in the face of Jesus Christ. So, if these are unhelpful, what's a better way of thinking about the mystery of human suffering? Well, first, we need to think more deeply about what it means to be human. We need to go back and reflect together on the way that we've been made. And if you can take your Bibles and turn to page 2, we looked at, in Genesis chapter 3, the account of the fall. But I just want to look first, just very briefly, at the previous chapter in Genesis chapter 2, where describing the creation of humanity. And in chapter 2, verse 7, it says, "Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature." The Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground. And in the Hebrew, there's a very close connection between the name for the first human, Adam, and the ground, which is Adamah. So actually, it's in our very name, we are made out of the ground. And did you know the same is true in English? That the word human is derived from the word humus. Not the nice stuff you put on pita bread, but the compost heap. That's what we are made of. We are groundlings. It's in our very name. It's in our creation. We are created from the ground. And what does this mean? Well, it means that God chose to make us fragile, vulnerable, dependent, and to use a philosophical term, contingent, which means vulnerable to chance events. That's actually the way that God chose to make us. Notice this is not about the fall. The fall happens in the next chapter. This is about creation. And so, presumably God could have chose to make us powerful and strong and resilient, but instead he chose to make us pathetic and fragile and vulnerable and weak and dependent. And because of that, we are vulnerable to suffering. We are vulnerable to brokenness. We are vulnerable to abuse in our very creation. And there's where we start with the mystery. The mystery is that suffering actually starts with our fragility. It starts with the way that God chose us to be. And one of the interesting questions to reflect is why? Why did God choose to make us like this? Why did he choose to make us so fragile and so vulnerable? And what was his purposes? And perhaps that's something we'll come back to. But then if we go on into Genesis chapter 3, and we haven't time to go through this, a very important passage in detail, but here we have the account of human beings walking away from God's plans, of human beings deliberately choosing to disobey. And as they choose to disobey, human frailty and human vulnerability then becomes exacerbated and pervaded and imprisoned by evil. Because of the fall, in some mysterious way, all our humanity is affected by evil. And as we can see in the curses, the solemn curses that God pronounces, if you turn to verse 16, God says, I will multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. And then in verse 17, to the man, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. And then verse 19, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So those words are in the Anglican funeral service, dust to dust. The futility of human life has now become, because of the fall and because of evil, our human lives become trapped. And, we find the similar concept elsewhere in the Bible. So the writer of Ecclesiastes has the same theme. What happens to the children of man, what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. So from the perspective of the Scriptures, we live in a world that was created good, but it's also a world that is mysteriously broken and marred by evil. And our own humanity is also broken and marred by evil. So the tragedy of human suffering is inextricably linked to what it means to be human. But why are we made like this? Why does God allow it? Have we been abandoned to our fate by an uncaring creator? And so you can trace the theme through the Old Testament of there are many great cries or psalms of lament. When godly people cry out to God, why, O God, why? Like the lament in Psalm 94, O Lord, how long shall the wicked exult? They crush your people, they afflict your heritage. They kill the widow and the sojourner and murder the fatherless. And they say, the Lord does not see, the God of Jacob does not perceive. How long? And there are Christian people in Syria and in Iraq and in Yemen who are praying this prayer and crying out to God at this very moment. How long, oh God, how long? Don't you see? Don't you notice? Don't you care? So there is this great theme of lament that is pouring out to God. So that's the first point. Suffering, we must reflect more deeply on the reality of what it means to be human. The second point is we need then to look at Jesus, as I'm moving on quite rapidly, and the reality of human suffering. Because at last, after thousands of years of desperate cries and laments and tears, the Creator God himself steps onto the stage in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And so at last, we can hear from God himself. At last, we're going to get the explanation for all the pain, all the tears, all the agony. But the mysterious and wonderful truth is that we don't get an explanation from Jesus. Instead, God in the person of Jesus enters into the experience of suffering himself. God himself enters into the experience of total fragility and dependence. He becomes a pathetic, fragile baby. He could do absolutely nothing for himself. He needs to have his bottom wiped. He needs to be fed. He needs to be kept warm. And at the end of his life on earth, on the cross, the God of the universe is stretched out, and with outstretched arms, he croaks, I am thirsty. And he can do nothing for himself. He has made himself utterly dependent. So the God whom Jesus reveals is a God who weeps at the graveside of Lazarus, a God who is deeply moved at the suffering of an anonymous widow in the town of Nain who's lost her only son. Time and time again, the gospel writers point out that Jesus is deeply emotionally involved and that he cares. And finally, on the cross, he takes the pain and the evil and the suffering of the world into his own self, into his own body. Isaiah the prophet, speaking of Jesus, says, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. This is God himself being described as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. At Gethsemane, on the night before he was to be crucified, Mark's gospel says he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. And he says, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And on the cross, there is that terrible cry of dereliction when Jesus takes onto his own lips the words of the most poignant lament in the whole of the Old Testament, which is Psalm 22. And most Bible scholars believe that actually Jesus was quoting Psalm 22 on the cross. He was taking onto his own lips that words of lament, my God, why have you forsaken me? So in a strange and wonderful way, suffering is not something that is external to God. No, suffering goes into the very heart of God himself. Christ brings suffering and lament into the heart of the Godhead. On the cross, God is lamenting to God. So it seems that God refuses to hold himself away from human suffering. He takes it into his own being in order to bring healing and redemption. He overcomes the destructive effects of evil in the creation, not by shattering it with overwhelming force, but by entering into it with costly love. So the God we worship is a suffering God. John Stott writes this passage, I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. The only God I believe in is the God on the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to pain? And he carries on, I have entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of the Buddha, his legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing round his mouth, a remote look on his face, detached from the agonies of the world. But each time, after a while, I've had to turn away, and in imagination I have turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross, nails through hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding, mouth dry, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He laid aside his immunity to pain. And Edward Shillito was a very well-known poet who lived through the First World War. He was actually there in France, and he was shattered by the terrible evil and suffering that he observed. And he wrote a poem entitled Jesus of the Scars. And the final bit of the poem is this: the other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. But to our wounds, only God's wounds can speak. And not a God has wounds, but thou alone. Just to recap that wonderful line, to our wounds, only God wounds can speak. And that's really the heart of what we see in Jesus. Not an explanation, but an identity that Christ himself, that God in the person of Christ, is a wounded God who is wounded for us. But then thirdly, the story doesn't stop there, because suffering can be redeemed. As God enters into the suffering and evil through the cross, he brings redemption. And that's the deepest mystery. Through Christ's suffering and death, evil is being destroyed and new life is springing up. God's plan for this age is not to abolish human suffering, but to redeem it, to bring blessing and healing out of evil and pain. That's what God loves to do. And it's been my experience too. Some years ago, as I mentioned, I experienced a devastating psychiatric breakdown, and I found myself in a locked psychiatric ward. I went through a period of deep internal anguish and psychological pain. It was my own private and personal hell. I'm going to talk a little more about it this evening, but what I want to say now is that by God's grace, I've increasingly seen how he has redeemed this painful experience in my life. It's taken years of gradual healing and learning and repenting and changing, but he has brought unexpected blessing into my life. And he's given me a new way of sharing with other people. And it really is true. God loves to bring blessing and healing out of evil and suffering, if only we allow him to do this. And I've become convinced there's nothing that can happen, however evil, however twisted, however malevolent, however meaningless, which cannot in some sense be transformed by God's grace and turned into blessing and healing. Now that's a statement of faith. I can't prove it, but I believe it. It's not something we can always see with our own eyes, but I believe it's true, and many millions of Christians would say the same thing too. So God's mysterious plan for this age is not to abolish human suffering, but to redeem it, to transform it from evil into bring blessing and healing. But it doesn't happen automatically. We have to learn to say what Jesus said in the Garden of Gethsemane. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. It's that acceptance, that godly acceptance, that's the route to change suffering into healing. So we've looked at the way we're made, fragile and vulnerable. We've looked at our own humanity that's been broken and marred by evil. We've seen how God enters into the reality of our humanity and how suffering goes into the very heart of the Godhead. But now we look into the future in the passage in Romans chapter 8. And if you could just turn to that in Romans chapter 8, which is now page 944, where Paul says, I consider in verse 18 that our present suffering, the sufferings of this present time, are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And if you look down to verse 21, the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Suffering and glory. Time and time again in the Bible, these two things seem to go together. In fact, sometimes it seems that glory is just the reverse side of suffering. Suffering and glory. Suffering and glory. The very wounds of Christ's hands, of marks of suffering, become marks of glory when he is raised and transformed. And it's the same for us too. Our very wounds can be transformed and become glorified by God's grace. And, in this passage, this wonderful passage in Romans 8, there's a symphony of groaning. The creation is groaning, in verse 22. And then in verse 23, we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly. And then in verse 26, the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. So the creation is groaning, we are groaning, and the Spirit himself is groaning. How long, O Lord? How long? And, the interesting thing is that these are not groans of despair. No, they're groans of longing and anticipation, waiting for the transformation which will surely come. So what we find in this strange story is a strange combination of sadness and pain and suffering mingled with joy and longing for the future. How long, O Lord? How long? So it only just struck me as I was preparing this sermon that those words of deep longing and groaning in the Psalms, how long, are transformed at the end of Revelation into words of anticipation. How long, O Lord? Come soon, come soon. So the same cry is changed from a lamenting groaning into a cry of anticipation. Because suffering and pain will finally be abolished. And in Revelation 21:4, we hear this: He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death, no more mourning, no more crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Yes, suffering and pain and death are going to be finally destroyed. Not in this age, but in the age that is to come. And in Isaiah chapter 65, we find these words, one of the words that have meant such a lot to me as a paediatrician. Isaiah is looking forward towards the new heaven and the new earth and the new Jerusalem. And he says, I will rejoice over Jerusalem and take delight in my people. The sound of weeping and of crying will be heard in it no more. Never again will there be in it an infant who lives but a few days. And that means a lot to me as a paediatrician. God sees the terrible agony of a little life that is snuffed out. And he says, never again will there be an infant who lives but a few days. That's what this particular paediatrician longs for, the day that is coming. Let's have a moment of silence and prayer. Just a moment of silence as we reflect on what the Spirit is saying to us. Lord Jesus, we humble ourselves before you, the one who entered into the experience of suffering, of pain, of woundedness, the one who was acquainted with grief. And we praise you that your plan is not to leave us in our suffering, but to redeem, to bring blessing and healing out of suffering and evil. So teach us what it means to say to you, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And write this hope deep in our hearts that one day, you are going to wipe away every tear from our eyes. In the name of the Lord Jesus. Amen.